Just some stuff that's coming up in the near future. First, shout out to Andy for putting this program together. He's comms director and has been doing a great job of it when he's not fighting the wars. We've got to also acknowledge that Hugh Foy, who's here tonight, is recently elected to the PNHP's national board, and he'll be representing the Western region. So today, I don't know how many of you had a chance to see the national webinar on Medicare Disadvantage. It was about a 1-hour session around, I think it was 1 o'clock today. And it was good. And it'll be on, it was recorded, so I'll probably send out a link to it in the next day or two. One thing they were talking about was the investigation of the Medicare Advantage overpayments. They put this all together. It took them, they were working on this for several weeks to get all the data collected, but it's really an important expose of Medicare Disadvantage. So there'll be some of that in the webinar that you can see when the video is put out. But anyway, you can download this from our PNHP website. Northwest Health Law Advocates is having a webinar this coming Friday on advancing patients' rights for a new era. And I think you have to pay $5 or something to watch that, but there's, I think, a link on our website from it. Healthcare for All Washington, of which Ronnie is the president, and Sherry puts out the newsletter, which is a fabulous newsletter. So if you guys don't get the newsletter, you should. So you're having your annual meeting this coming Saturday, right, at Horizon House?
That's correct.
And everybody knows where Horizon House is. It's kind of downtown Seattle area. There's usually some parking.
900 University, and it's 1 block from Virginia Mason Hospital.
And you can usually find parking on the street there if you don't want to bus it.
And it'll be opening with a panel discussion on lowering drug prices, featuring some national speakers and Senator Kaiser, the president pro tempore of the Washington State Senate. So people from the Democracy Project and Prescription Justice who are on the East Coast will be joining us for a discussion. We'll talk about our legislative agenda, and then we'll reelect the same officers again and again and again.
Okay, the big event coming up is the PNH annual meeting in Atlanta, Georgia, coming up on November 11th and 12th. And 3 of our board members are going, myself, Sherry, and Hugh. And we're also having 10 SNAP members, Students for a National Health Program, from our Washington State area, and I think Wyoming also are going to that. So there's big infusion of younger people into our chapter and area here. So that's really nice. Our next PNHP monthly meeting, November 15th, there'll be a report back from what happened at the PNHP national meeting. Healthcare is a human right has its general meeting on November 13th. I think it's at the Washington State Labor Council. They'll be discussing, and we're a member of that and one of the founding members. We'll be discussing priorities for the 2024 upcoming Washington legislative session. So I think it'll probably be online as well as in person.
Okay, so Andy, are you prepared to introduce our speaker?
I am. So tonight's speaker is Jon Shelton, professor and chair of Democracy and Justice Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Green Bay. He is also the vice president of higher education for the American Federation of Teachers Wisconsin, and a member of Green Bay's first ever Equal Rights Commission. Jon is also the author of a new book right now called The Education Myth: How Human Capital Trumps Social Democracy, which that's actually kind of how I initially learned about Jon. I saw him on the Majority Report discussing this. And so, because they're also touching upon the meritocracy narrative. But Anyway, for all of those who have appeared tonight, the topic is healthcare as a human right. And obviously, this is like a phrase that's been around now since at least the 2016 election, even before. But people always like to ask the question, well, that's fine, like, but how are you going to pay for it? And we've talked at length about that. If anybody is curious, we can always send you the links to that. But the short answer of how you're going to pay for it is you make it a national priority. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about tonight, is like, why should we make that a national priority in a broader context also of other universal rights. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Professor Jon Shelton.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Andy, for inviting me and putting all this together. I'm excited to be here. I did want to say that where I live, Green Bay, I appreciate the land acknowledgement, because we are on traditional Menominee and Menominee land, and Wisconsin in general is traditional Menominee and Ho-Chunk. We have 12 recognized tribes in the state, and they're a really important part of our civic life here. Much of Green Bay actually is Oneida Reservation, which was originally Menominee land that the Oneidas, I don't know how much you know about their history, but they actually supported the Americans during the Revolution, and they were repaid by being pushed west, essentially, at least the folks who came to Green Bay or Wisconsin area. So very much important part of our life here, and appreciate that land acknowledgement. That's really, really important. All right, so I'm gonna just share my screen here. I'm a professor, so it's not just college students that do this, it's also professors who kind of do things at the last minute. So I kind of have a slightly different title as I was thinking about this today, or past couple days when I put this together. But I'm titling this "To Secure These Rights," which is a phrase that hopefully y'all know, or maybe you don't know, but if you don't, you should. That comes from the Declaration of Independence, and I'm going to get into that. And the title is here, the subtitle is "The American Case for Social and Economic Democracy, Including Universal Healthcare." One of the reasons I wanted to kind of talk about things this way, as Andy mentioned, I have this book out, and the book really is a book. It's called The Education Myth. I'll just go to that, actually. Hang on a second. These are the two books that I've written. The second book, I think on your right, is The Education Myth, How Human Capital Trumps Social Democracy. And it sounds like, okay, the title has education in it, so it must be a book about education. But weirdly, it's not really a book about education. I mean, it is, but the book is really about what it is that is politically possible in the United States now at this moment, and how we got to that place. And the reason, and so my argument is that up until very recently, the possibilities for American politics in terms of big universal social and economic rights, things like universal healthcare, have been very limited. So one of the things that I hear a lot in our political conversations about things like, all kinds of different things, labor rights, like the extent that workers have union rights in European countries, universal health care, which many of us, I'm guessing all of you know that, like, that's something that is much better in Europe than it is in the United States. Not perfect in a lot of places, but much better. Other kinds of social benefits, unemployment, worker retraining, all these things. Oftentimes I hear people kind of make the argument that we should be looking to, I don't know, the Nordic countries for examples of how we should think about social and economic rights. I don't know how many of y'all are Bernie Sanders people, but, I'm guessing if you support universal health care, there's a good chance many of you are. And even Bernie, who, in full disclosure, was a candidate that I supported and actively tried to get elected in both 2016 and 2020. Some of my frustrations are kind of how he talked about healthcare in terms of trying to emulate European countries. And I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with doing that, but the argument I want to make here, which is why I talked about the American case for social democracy in my title, is that we don't need to necessarily look to European countries to find political possibilities. In fact, what we can do is look at the long past, but especially the more recent past in American history, to see a moment in which, right at the center of our political mainstream, were calls for big transformative economic rights, things like universal healthcare. And so I'm not an expert on healthcare. I'm not going to tell you anything about healthcare specifically that you don't already know. What I am going to do is hopefully to help you get maybe some, I don't know, it's been a bit of a long day, so I'll just use this word, although I'm uncomfortable with it, some ammunition for the argument for big transformative social policies like universal healthcare. Okay. And to do that, I'm going to argue that call is deeply rooted in the American tradition. Right. And so that's where I kind of that's what I want us to think about here. Okay. So, and by the way, feel free to I teach daily. I teach all the time. I do a ton of media stuff. So if you just want to interrupt with a question at any point, just feel free to do that. It's not going to be a problem on my end. I'm happy to do that, to answer it and just have a conversation. All right. So I want us to start here. And this is the Declaration of Independence, obviously. This is a document that I've increasingly been using when I teach undergraduates about the American promise. I use it a lot when I, am doing interviews about the book or interviews about other stuff. I do a weekly call-in radio show, for example. And, this is one of my big kind of framing devices for thinking about American democracy. Okay. And I'm drawing a lot of I kind of got inspired to do this from a book that came out, I guess it was about 7 or 8 years ago now, by a political theorist named Danielle Allen, who's at Harvard. And some of you may have heard of her. She ran in the Massachusetts gubernatorial election as a Democrat, didn't win the primary, but I think in 2022 maybe. And she talked about the Declaration as being a document that really promises fundamental human equality. But more than that, that promises everybody, which she says, equal access to the machinery of government, right? To have the things that are necessary to have government do things for people to ensure that they have good lives, right? And I'm not going to read this whole thing to you, but I want to just zero in on one specific part of this, the part that's bolded, as you won't be surprised. These truths are self-evident, meaning they're obvious, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay. Now let's stop there for a minute. Everybody has certain unalienable rights. Unalienable means that things cannot be taken away from you, right? They're a government cannot take them away from you because they're endemic to what it means to be human. That was a transformative call in 1776. And whatever you think about the contradictions of American history at the time, or the fact that a man who owned enslaved people wrote these words, that was a transformative promise, right? And then among these, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Well, what do those things mean? I mean, obviously there's a lot of interpretation there, but one of the things that I'm going to kind of argue is that if we think about this as the kind of fundamental American creed, the American promise, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is something that's ever changing, right? It was written in a world that was very different than ours. But if we're still going to live by this creed, which I think we absolutely should, and I think probably most Americans would agree, then how do we ensure that people have access to those things, right? We'll get into that in just a second, but I want you to kind of think about that, right? In 1776, maybe what that meant was, not having, the government quarter troops in your home, right? The Third Amendment to the Constitution eventually. But we live in a very different world. And so to have life, freedom, and to be able to pursue happiness, maybe you need things like rights on the job, right? Maybe due process rights, so you don't get fired and lose your job because of the whim of your employer. Maybe you need things like universal healthcare. So I think when we think about these big claims about why people need something like healthcare, let's think about the fundamental call to action that's at the very core of American democracy. And then this next part's really important too. Is to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So why are governments set up? Right? You hear this from libertarians that governments are just set up to protect property rights and allow people the freedom to, duke it out in the marketplace, a marketplace where, there's all kinds of unequal power. That's not what the founders intended. That's not what this means. What this means is that if you're going to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, governments are there to secure those rights, right? So it's just a question of, what does it mean to have those rights be unalienable? How do we ensure those? That's why governments are there. Okay. So I want us to kind of think about that foundation. That's really important. All right. And I want us to also think about this in the framework of a political theorist named T.H. Marshall. And I promise we're going to get more into more into some specific historical stuff. I'm just kind of like setting the framework right now. So Marshall was this political theorist, and we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about who he was exactly, but he conceptualized the way democracies evolved in a way that I think is really, really useful for people to think about. And this comes from an essay that he wrote in 1950 called On Citizenship. And I think the time that he wrote, as you'll see from the rest of my talk, is really, really important, because this is right after, obviously the fight to defeat global fascism, and how liberal democracies were going to reorient themselves, also within the context of the growing Cold War, right? So what Marshall talked about, he said, and he was mainly talking about the kind of European framework, but I think this fits in the United States as well. He says, the kind of first step toward toward a liberal democracy is civil rights, right? He says that the first thing that happens is people fight for, equality under the law. In the 1600s and 1700s, in places like France, there were literally like separate court systems for people in different stations. So if you were a commoner, you were accused of a crime or sued somebody, you would be dealt with in one court. If you were a noble, you'd be dealt with in another court. Free expression, all kinds of ideas could be censored. Ben Franklin, for example, we associate him with Philadelphia. Ben Franklin came to Philadelphia before the American Revolution because he had been censored by he published a newspaper that the imperial authorities in Massachusetts didn't like, right? And so he ended up leaving because he would have been arrested and probably put in prison. So, the struggle from the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s in a society that's deeply hierarchical, in which most people can't vote, is one for basic civil rights, property rights, right? The right to be treated equally under the law, the right to free expression. And then once those start getting established, people start pushing for political rights, the right to participate in decision-making, the right to vote, the right to run for office. Probably some of y'all know this, but at the nation's founding, 1776, and for the first few decades after that, you couldn't vote unless you owned a certain amount of property. So even most white men, we think of the revolution as being limited to, say, white men, right? Like African Americans were enslaved. Women obviously had no political rights, but actually most white men didn't have the right to vote unless they owned a specific amount of property in virtually every state. There are a few exceptions. Pennsylvania was one, but for the most part. And this is really, I think, the important part of what I'm talking about here. What Marshall says is that, once you have a more modern economy, a capitalist economy in which more things are being exchanged in the marketplace and people are selling their labor, you now start to have people pushing for what he calls social and economic rights, social goods that people need to have good lives in a more modern, the kind of modern capitalist society that we all recognize. And he talked about things like the right to a job, the right to an education, the right to healthcare. And many of these fights came from working people and unions and liberal reformers. Okay. So I just want to kind of set up this framework because oftentimes I think you hear from conservatives, Andy framed this as like, how are we going to pay for that? I think the bigger question is, if we're thinking about the evolution of democracies and what people need, the bigger question is, how are we not going to pay for that? Right. That's the bigger question. And so, if we center social and economic rights for all people in a country, it's not a question of how we pay for it. It's a question of how we make it happen, right? Because those questions of how we're going to pay for it are really about trying to limit political possibilities. They're not actually about facing an issue of paying for things. They're in the wealthiest country in the history of the world. We have the resources many times over to pay for all the social and economic rights that people need. Okay. So I want to start for a second with Thomas Jefferson. And the reason I'm starting with him is for one specific reason. I want to point out to you that, I've set this up as civil, political, and social economic rights. But actually, those three things don't map on top of each other as neatly chronologically as Marshall kind of pointed out, right? In fact, at the nation's founding, there were American thinkers who are pushing for not like super well developed versions of economic rights, but what we might think of as like prototypes, right? Making like proto arguments for these kinds of social goods. And so one of the things that a lot of people probably don't know about Jefferson is when he was in Virginia after the American Revolution, he proposed a plan that would have essentially given, right? I mean, you think about the ways that conservatives talk about the framers as these like, libertarians or something. Jefferson's plan was to give every white citizen of the state of Virginia 50 acres of land. And the reason for that is because the assumptions at the time were that, land ownership, property ownership were important for political rights to be able to vote. And so Jefferson, instead of saying like, well, go out and save up your money and buy land, said, no, let's do this the other way. Let's just give everybody access to land so they have economic independence, what we might think of as economic security, but he thought about it as economic independence. The plan didn't happen, but I'm pointing this out to say we have this tradition deeply, deeply embedded in American history. Okay, this was not a libertarian revolution. It just wasn't. Another example of this is Thomas Paine, wrote Common Sense, this really important argument for eliminating the monarchical relationship that Americans had. Very important document. It came out 6 months before the Declaration, actually, and was very influential. But Paine, was a transnational revolutionary. He was actually British. Came to America really just a few years before the American Revolution, and then got deeply involved. Also became involved in the French Revolution. Almost got executed, actually, when things went, bad in the French Revolution. But he wrote this tract. You can see it was printed in Philadelphia. This was in the 1790s, 1790, I believe, the year 1790. And it's called Agrarian Justice. And the argument in Agrarian Justice is it actually sounds very modern if you think about it. It's some sort of like universal basic income or something like that. You can see this here. We've got, I don't know if you read revolutionary English too much or script, but it's got these weird S's. So like in the middle there, it's pretty small font, but I'll read it to you. It says, to pay to every person, that's not an F, that's an S, to pay to every person when arrived at the age of 21 years, the sum of 15 pounds sterling to enable him or her to begin the world. And also 10 pounds sterling per annum during life to every person now living of the age of 50 years, and to all others when they shall arrive at that age, to enable them to live in old age without wretchedness and go decently out of the world. So let me translate that for you. What he's saying is that the American government, under this proposal, would establish a fund, right, that would pay everybody when they got to the age of 21, 15 pounds sterling, which would give them a stake in the world, right? It would give them like basically resources to start out with, as a way to level the playing field between people who had wealth and people who didn't have. The second part of this is once 10 pounds a year to everybody once they turn the age of 50, right? This is 1790, 145 years before the Social Security Act was passed. But that's basically what he's talking about here, right? So I'm not saying that Thomas Paine was at the center of the American political thought in the 1790s, but the point is you have people very early in the nation's history pushing for social and economic rights. I mean, this is deeply embedded. It's a thread that runs through American history, and it's important for us to recognize that. Now we come to the Civil War, and don't worry about reading all this. I'm gonna just have a couple things I want to highlight here. This, of course, is the Gettysburg Address from 1863. I won't ask anybody to recite it. Interesting to note that I asked my students this. I had to learn to recite it when I was their age, but apparently none of them do this anymore.
You'd mentioned if we had a thought, I don't want to get you just to kind of bring certain people up to speed if they haven't recently read John Locke. These enlightened thinkers were kind of at a watershed moment of human existence, right? Because it was these social contract thinkers that were impacting a lot of this literature that you're saying, right?
Yep.
And just so people understand, like where we're going with this is right, is that an idea that maybe we should reimagine what the social contract would be, right?
Yep.
And just to marry it, why, I mean, some people might think it's hyperbolic to say it, but at the rate things are going in America, if this sounds like a lot of scholarly talk, the thing is, like, in a lot of ways, we are resembling the Weimar Republic, which, if you ever read about that, a lot of the discord, let's call it, in America, this feeling of collapse, and where a lot of energy is going, where you want to call it proto-fascism or whatnot. It seems like because people's basic needs are not being met.
Yep.
So I don't know if there's a way to like parlay that into human needs with what the enlightened thinkers, because it seems kind of it seems like a same human problem, I guess, right? That that the enlightened thinkers were trying to meet, right?
I think so. I mean, okay, the thing you have to realize about people like Locke and Jefferson and others is that they were definitely pushing for a new social contract, right? It was one that didn't include everybody, right? And that's important to recognize. Even Jefferson, that plan, he was definitely imagining a scenario where a greater number of people would be included in kind of that social contract, like meeting the needs of a greater number of people. It really only included like white families, right? And that's important to recognize. So what I'm trying to get us to see here is how we get to the point that this really does become kind of a universal promise. And so I think the reason I like the Declaration as a founding place, right? And it comes out of Locke, and it comes out of a lot of those other European thinkers that were in that Enlightenment tradition that you're kind of referencing, and they're using universal language, but the foundation, like the promise is universal, but the way a lot of people understood it wasn't that it was universal yet, right? It's kind of a bizarre contradiction, right? So you have Jefferson who's saying all men are created equal. He also literally owned enslaved people, right? So, but I think what's important about that, yes, is that like that promise of universality is something that ordinary people who were left out could lay claim to in the years since. And so what I'm going to argue is that what happens is more and more working people start to lay claim to it, to the point where this has now become something that's, I think, deeply embedded in how most working people think about what it means to be a universal right. Does that kind of make sense? That's kind of where I'm headed here.
Yeah, thank you. I was kind of taking you up on your option where you said jump in if we had a
yeah. No, I appreciate that.
I want to make sure I'm like, if anybody hasn't recently read Locke, that they're like, because the thing is, part of the point here is that it is relevant to modern times, at least like the human needs that these people were expressing, 300-400 years ago, to now. Like, it's just, I don't know, it's a thing we're grappling with. But anyway, I was just trying to, I took you up on your offer, like jumping in.
Yeah, but are you saying that everybody here hasn't read Locke today?
Raise your hand, everybody. Did you read Locke yesterday?
Okay, so yeah, let's kind of talk about how these claims of this social contract get bigger, and how they include, the real kind of claim for economic rights and having government secure those rights. So this is the Gettysburg Address. The only thing I want you to take out of this is that last part, right? That what Lincoln is talking about the Civil War being about is a new birth of freedom. New birth of freedom is really the key thing. That the nation is moving in a different direction, having ended slavery. Okay. And oftentimes when we think about the Civil War, we think about that being this battle between slavery and freedom, right? Abolishing slavery. And it absolutely was. But the Civil War was about, and I know that's a huge principle, but the Civil War is about really a principle that's even bigger than that. And abolishing slavery very much fits in there. Okay. Now, this is from a speech Lincoln gave in 1861, and it was at the very end of the first year he was inaugurated in office. Don't worry about reading this whole thing. I just want to point to a couple of things. He says first, it continues to develop that the insurrection is a war upon the first principle of government, of popular government, the rights of the people. right? And he's talking about the Southern secessionists who wanted to destroy the country, right? And he says these people sometimes hint at monarchy as a possible refuge from the power of the people, saying that like maybe in the South they might even install a king, right? And he says basically like, I don't need to talk about that. Like, nobody in the North really wants to go back to monarchy. But he says that one thing that's really important, he says this is also a fight to place capital on an equal footing with or above labor in the structure of government, saying that like people who have wealth and power should have more rights than workers. Okay. He says basically that it's concluded that everybody in the country are becoming either hired laborers or what we call slaves. And further, it is assumed that whoever is once a hired laborer is fixed in that condition for life. So what he's saying here is that the push for slavery is about a world in which, to extend slavery is about a world in which some people own property and everybody else, whether they're selling their labor or they're enslaved people, is, basically subservient to those people, right? And I want you to think about this because I know this is a long speech and maybe it's a little confusing, but I want you to think about that because I want you to think about the Civil War and this big struggle that happens at the center of American politics in the 1800s as one that's about this principle of whether ordinary people should have the same rights as people who own access to capital, right? And so Lincoln makes the argument that that's what this war is really about, and the fight to end slavery becomes a part of that. Lincoln had this vision that the United States could be a world where somebody could work for wages for a little while and then become economically independent, that they could maybe save enough money to buy their own farm or buy their own shop and make tools or something like that. But even at that time, Lincoln was kind of stuck in the past, okay? And so I would just want you to look at this real quick. What this shows is the percentage of Americans basically owned their own land or shop, didn't have to sell their wages every day in American history. And you can see that in 1780, essentially the nation's founding, 80% of Americans, free Americans, unenslaved, owned they weren't selling their wages in the workplace. They were working for themselves. They were growing crops or producing tools and selling them in the market. And look what happens in the 1800s. That number goes from about 80% to below 40%. By the year 1900, it's about 25%, right? And that's really important because what that means is that virtually, or the vast majority of Americans, to the point where we are today, almost all Americans, right, who work for a living, are working for somebody else, right? They're selling their wages in the marketplace. They're dependent on the market in order to make ends meet, okay? And so when you start to see that happening in the late 19th century, you start to see massive fights, right? Workers organizing. You all know something about this, right? The Gilded Age in the late 19th century, when you've got, I promise I'm getting to healthcare. We're going to get there, all right? But this is important to establish this, where you see workers organizing in order to throw off the power of corporations that are basically telling them, if something happens to you and you get hurt on the job, we're throwing you out on the street. If there's an economic downturn, you lose your job, right? And with it, maybe you lose your housing, right? And so this is one example of a massive strike in 1877 where workers actually burned down the rail depot, right? And the reason I'm pointing this out is to say that this problem over what the economic lives of working people are going to be like becomes the central problem in American politics in the late 19th century, and goes all the way up until the New Deal, right? That's really important because that fight that I was talking about for economic and social rights becomes fought on the terrain of workers organizing and social reformers pushing for things like workers' compensation and all kinds of other things. Yeah, go ahead. I see a hand up.
Yes, that previous slide that you showed, it seems to mirror the rise of industrial capitalism.
Yep, 100%.
So that's what I take from that slide.
Yeah, that's a great observation, right? And there's part of these people who are losing I mean, it's in some cases it's like literal people losing their access to like what, you know, Marxists might call the means of production, right? These are people who like might have had their own shop and lost it when another shop consolidated and set up assembly line production, right? I mean, that happened in like a lot in I mean, New England, right? I mean, the shoe production worked that way. It was in the 1820s and 30s done through artisanal shops. By the 1840s and 50s, it was almost all like virtual assembly line kind of outfits. Some people like literally lose their economic independence. Other of these folks are immigrants coming from Europe, you know, and working in, you know, steel factories and all other kinds of heavy industry. So yeah, but yeah, you're absolutely right. Like you could track this along with like the concentration of corporate power at the same time. Actually, yeah, that's a great observation. Okay, workers fight things out. You don't need me to go through all these, but I just wanted to have a couple examples to say, like, it wasn't just like a one-off thing, right? I mean, there were these vicious battles when concentrated capital tried to prevent workers from organizing for better wages and time off from work and all these other kinds of things that workers need to have good lives in the context of a modern economy. All right. 1894, in the context of a really, really terrible depression. We think of the Great Depression as the Great Depression, right, that started with the stock market crash in 29. Actually, before the Great Depression, when people talked about the Great Depression, they were talking about the Panic of 1893, when you had massive unemployment and a federal government that did almost nothing, right? There were efforts by working people to organize to get the government to secure things like the right to employment. One of these is a big march that started in Ohio that went all the way to DC called Coxey's Army, led by a military veteran named Jacob Coxey. This was also the time, you all probably know, The Jungle, the novel, right, where you have working people increasingly just working in these awful conditions and child labor, right? I mean, in The Jungle documents workers, you know, as young as 11 and 12 going into these factories and you know, losing limbs and getting mangled and all these different things. Okay, so the reason I'm pointing all this out is to say it's from this context in which workers had virtually no social or economic rights that they start organizing, right? And that there's a political movement of mainstream politicians that starts to coalesce around a broad call for social and economic rights, okay? Some of you have probably heard of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in 1911, which was this factory in New York City where the owners literally locked the doors because they were afraid women who were seamstresses who were completely impoverished were going to steal scraps of cloth, right? And so because they were able to do that and there were virtually no regulations, 134 actually women ended up either burning to death or jumping out of windows and dying, right? So this really signified to a lot of, you know, political reformers at the time that something needed to be done about this. All right. So out of the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire and out of this is just really an example of kind of the through line here. But you start to have, again, this political movement emerge around social and economic reforms that are going to bring workers more rights. So this is Frances Perkins. She was the first female cabinet member in American history. She was the Secretary of Labor under FDR. But before that, Perkins was a reformer in New York, and she was appointed to a commission to study the problems with the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire because it had gotten so much attention. And then as part of this commission, she worked with this guy, Robert Wagner, who was a senator in New York. You don't need to know their names. I'm just pointing out the political trajectory here, the path. They both were on this commission and they suggested a bunch of reforms, some of which actually happened in New York, but they got close. They became part of the kind of inner circle of FDR because FDR was governor of New York in the 1920s. Okay. So when the Depression happens, right, and you all know the iconic images of the Depression, you have workers pushing for social and economic rights. You have reformers like FDR and Perkins and Wagner all pushing for these kind of rights. And you really have this kind of moment where all of it comes together with the New Deal. Okay. All right, here's FDR. He gets inaugurated. He gets elected in 1932 and inaugurated in 1933. And, you know, there's a lot of important stuff that happens in the New Deal. I just want to point out that there's a core of reforms in the New Deal, right? Go back to Marshall, the idea of social and economic rights. There is an intellectual and political coherence to the New Deal that I want you all to remember, right? And to think about as an important political tradition when you make an argument for something like universal healthcare, okay? That is our tradition as Americans, that social and economic, that tradition of social and economic rights. To go back to Andy's point, there's really a new sort of social contract. It's partially formed, but it's formed during the New Deal, right? The idea really that Americans deserve economic security, right? That to have the promise of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness means that workers have their social and economic needs taken care of, okay? So you have things like the Social Security Act, which, allows workers, gives workers retirement, right? But also establishes that if somebody's disabled, they're going to have a level of economic security. The National Labor Relations Act gives workers the right to form unions and to have a say in their conditions at their workplace if they have a union and collective bargaining. The Emergency Relief Appropriations Act creates millions of jobs for workers. The Fair Labor Standards Act establishes things like minimum wage, and the 40-hour work week comes out of the Fair Labor Standards Act. So this is a coherent political program. And here's what's really important about it, okay? The way FDR kind of frames this is he says that all of that increase of corporate power as the nation has changed, right? That he says this right here. This is one of the most radical speeches you will ever hear from a presidential candidate. This is his acceptance of the nomination of the Democratic Party in 1936. He's running for re-election after he passes most of those really important pieces of legislation that working people wanted, right? He says, this is an argument, a political theoretical argument here that he makes. It's a beautiful argument, really. He gives the speech in Philadelphia and he says, it's great to be in Philadelphia giving this speech because, we come out of that tradition. He says political tyranny was wiped out at Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776. But as the nation has changed, right? He says man's inventive genius released new forces that completely changed people's lives, reordered them, he says. Railroads, steam, electricity, telegraph, radio, mass production. All of these combined to bring a new civilization and a new problem for those who sought to remain free. For out of this modern civilization, economic royalists carved new dynasties, right? Creating their concentration of control over material things. So he links the economic domination that corporations, right? The Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the way that they limited the possibilities for working people. And he says, that's the new problem. He says, this is the new royalists. These are the royalists that are in the tradition of like the king of England, the king of the UK, wasn't the UK at the time, but you get what I'm saying, in 1776, right? And he says, government has to be a force to limit those people, to limit their power, and to create, again, I think a new social contract, right? To create new rights for people, and it's corporate power that's going to stand in their way. So, right, that goes back to the question of like, how are we going to pay for it? Those are entrenched interests, right? Those are health insurance corporations. I would argue economic royalists that are trying to tell us we can't have those things because they have power in that situation, right? Through their profits, right? And he says, here he says basically that statement, he says what they really complain of, and you could talk about this, I think, in terms of health insurance companies now that seek to prevent something like a single payer healthcare, is that we seek to take away their power. Our allegiance to American institutions requires the overthrow of this kind of power. In vain, they seek to hide behind the flag and the Constitution. In their blindness, they forget what the flag and the Constitution stands for, right? And what it stands for are securing the rights, right, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, so very important. And FDR wins by a landslide margin. This is the biggest electoral margin in the 20th century, with the exception of Johnson in 1964. It's huge, biggest electoral vote. I mean, that's popular vote, biggest electoral vote margin of anybody in the 20th century. Completely realigns American politics around the promise of economic and social rights. Okay. And it's not because people are like, we think Democrats are good, or we like FDR personally. It's around this new social contract. Okay. That's important because we don't have to look to Sweden to make the case for universal health care. All we have to do is look to our own past and the arguments that one of the most popular presidents in American history made, right? With the support and enthusiasm of the voters, right? And American politics got realigned in 1936. This is the moment when working people across the board started voting Democrat. It's the moment when African-American workers started voting Democrat, actually. It's 36, okay? And then FDR extends this idea 8 years later when he gives what I think is maybe the most important presidential speech in American history. He calls for, and yeah, more important than the Gettysburg Address, he calls for an economic Bill of Rights in 1944. He says, during this war, it's all in the context of the war, right? Global struggle against fascism. He says, what this war has shown us is that we have come to a clear realization of the fact that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. People who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made. And he very much, Andy, was thinking about Weimar Germany when he was talking about that, right? And how the Nazis came to power and how Mussolini came to power, right? Because those people in those countries did not have economic security. And he says, in our day, these economic truths have become, think about the language here. He's drawing on the Declaration. He's drawing on the Constitution. These economic truths have become accepted as self-evident. We've accepted a second Bill of Rights under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all.
So as you're talking, I'm reflecting on the fact of clearly there's like a cycle of oligarchy of like, because pre FDR making all these changes, there was the Lochner era, which sort of, I guess, resembles more and more we're going back. And I think it was Thomas Frank in his book or another writer who said, a lot of it wasn't just the economic boom from the war effort. It was a lot of these programs of FDR that set up this huge largesse for the public that helped the average American enrich themselves. And of course, they had to like wrestle power from corporate power to achieve this.
Yep.
And then they've only been trying to attack it now for the past 70, 80 years. And we're slowly getting back to that. And obviously when Locke and these other enlightened thinkers were thinking in the 1700s, they were probably also addressing this similar thing of human oppression of like, as a species, can we do better than this? And it makes me wonder, a question for you or the group, can we break this cycle of oppression from oligarchy, or are we just going to be condemned to this rinse and repeat? Or is it something what Hegel says, where he talks about the, like the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, you get you get like this thing happens, like the French Revolution, and then you have this extreme thing happen here, and then you get something in the middle. But can we break free of this thing of like the oligarchy just kind of like clinging back, clawing back that power?
Yeah. I mean, the answer to that question is yes. I don't subscribe to the idea that there's some kind of, I know you weren't putting it exactly this way, but that there was this like, that there's a historic pendulum of history or something like that, where, you've got basically like advance and reaction. I think the decisions that people make and that organizations make more accurately, and the organizing that we do, all of that matters. And so to that extent, we have really all the agency in the situation. And I think, yeah, people attack the New Deal, but there were also a lot of very specific decisions that were made that weakened the New Deal. And, my book is actually about, I'd argue that if I'm condemning any Democrats or Republicans more, I'm probably condemning Democrats more for some of the decisions they've made, not all of them, but because they moved away from this tradition that I'm talking about here, right, which was very popular. And, we expect Democrats, I think, to be the party of working people. And when they don't act that way, they're punished by voters, actually. So
sorry, I hope I didn't butcher Hegel in his
No, that's exactly how Hegel would see it. Although Hegel sees continuous advance, right? It's not, there's thesis, there's antithesis, and then synthesis is something new, right? And then things continue to kind of advance that way. And so to that, like, I think Hegel's a good metaphor for thinking about changes. And you weren't saying this. I'm mainly responding to, like, you sometimes get this idea that there's, like, again, history is like a pendulum, right? And there's moments where things go democratic and then they swing back. And I don't subscribe to that. I think we make decisions as agents of change. Okay, so this kind of claim here for universal rights that FDR sets up, there's all kinds of proposals for greater social and economic rights after FDR dies in 1945. So one of these is something called the Full Employment Act, which would have given everybody essentially the right to a job in this country. Doesn't happen for reasons kind of skip through a little bit here. And then, of course, you all know that Truman pushed for national health insurance as early as 1945, and that version of it anyway. And that got basically stopped because of the lobbying of the American Medical Association. But you know, this is the reason I'm pointing this out is to say it wasn't just FDR that was pushing for this stuff, right? This had created a new set of expectations for American workers. All the stuff that happened during the New Deal, right, and the Economic Bill of Rights. I mean, these were very popular things when people were polled in the 1940s on universal health care and the right to a job. These things were polling at like 75, 80% in that decade, right? These are very popular things coming out of World War II. The labor movement increases dramatically. Look at union membership here after 1935. And this is important, right? Because this means all this stuff you were just talking about, Andy, in terms of like wresting away power from corporations, that only comes with the labor movement, right? Having workers who can collectively bargain and get a bigger share of like what the economy is producing. We see that with the UAW right now, right? That's also important for healthcare too, by the way, because we don't get universal health insurance in the 1940s, right? Like the UK does with the National Health Service is created in the 1940s. Doesn't happen in the United States. And one of the reasons there's probably not more outcry is because all of these workers who are in unions and getting collectively bargained contracts, right? They're negotiating for healthcare, which creates, there's a historian named Gabriel Winant who writes about this. He's got a great book. He basically says that these union contracts became what he called insulated pools of security, right? So if you were a worker in a union, you got healthcare, but maybe if you weren't in a union, you had a job where maybe you didn't get healthcare, right? And so this covered a lot of people, but kind of broke apart the kind of natural constituency for universal healthcare back then. And we still see that today, right? There are unions now who like don't want to have universal healthcare because negotiating for healthcare is a big part of what they offer to their members. I think that's a mistake, by the way. I'm fully on board with universal healthcare, but that's a problem that we kind of have to deal with. You have activists like A. Philip Randolph, who was this is at the March on Washington in 1963, which was actually Randolph's idea. I don't know if y'all know that. He comes out of the labor movement, but pushed for the March on Washington. King just kind of showed up there and spoke. But Randolph and King and this other guy named Bayard Rustin came up with this proposal in 1967 called the Freedom Budget for all Americans. And I'm just illustrating this to show that like that promise of the New Deal, that promise of a new social contract, it doesn't go away, right? You still have Americans, prominent Americans like Randolph and Rustin pushing for this as late as the late 1960s, right? Here's the Freedom Budget, right? Looks a lot like the Economic Bill of Rights. Full employment, wages, decent standard of living, decent medical care and adequate educational opportunities. You know, they're calling for universal health care here, right? Doesn't happen. There's a lot of complicated reasons. One reason is because of the Vietnam War kind of sucks up a lot of the oxygen. But the point is that this push for broad economic and social rights is at the core of American politics, right? For 30 or 40 years in the middle of the 20th century. All we have to do is look back at that time and capture that promise. Humphrey Hawkins, we won't go through, I'll kind of move through this pretty quickly, but Humphrey Hawkins pushes for the right to a job for all Americans. Coretta Scott King, that's her on the right, called this Martin Luther King's legacy to end poverty, right? Doesn't happen in large part because a lot of Democratic politicians had moved in a different direction by the late 1970s, right? So just talk about that really quick. Let's skip this. You have some really important advances under somebody like Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, right? Johnson was a very good president in some ways, and I don't need to tell y'all that he signed into law Medicare and Medicaid. And he did it, I don't know if you know this, but he did it in Independence, Missouri, as a tribute to Harry Truman and his push for universal health care. Obviously, Medicare and Medicaid is more limited, doesn't give us everything that we want, but it does cover more people, and that was an advance, right? But this is the big point. Unfortunately, since about the 1960s, a growing number of prominent Democrats have, instead of been pushing for economic and social rights, have been pushing for, Andy mentioned this at the very beginning when the bit I did on the Majority Report, have been pushing for an economy that's built on this principle of meritocracy, that you only get access to things if you work hard for it, or increasingly there's an addendum to this, which is if you get the right education, then you can get a good enough job so that you get things like healthcare. No longer is this something that everybody should just have, right? We've moved away from that promise. Democratic politicians, I think, have done that because they think that's popular with voters. Although I would ask you how popular that really is with voters, given kind of the trajectory of the party, Trump getting elected, and Biden's approval rating essentially being underwater right now. And I think Biden's done some good things. We can get into that if you want, right? So Johnson, when he talks about the war on poverty, doesn't say people are poor because they live in places without good jobs or they don't have access to healthcare. He says it's because they're not educated the right way, and it's kind of their fault that they're poor. Carter, in the late 70s, when Coretta Scott King was pushing for the right to a job, and Ted Kennedy, by the way, was pushing for universal healthcare, right? He challenged Carter in the 1980 primary. Carter says, no, government actually, we need to limit the size of government. We need to have government do less things. I'm sorry to criticize Jimmy Carter. I know he's, kind of close to dying and a lot of people love him, but he made some really big mistakes, critical mistakes, I believe, as president. Just to throw a Republican in here, you've got George Bush talking about the way forward is for us to invest in human capital, not, you've got Clinton and Gore talking about, hey, the way America is going to end up with having people good jobs is to have the best educated, best trained workforce in the world, right? Yeah, he did put Hillary in charge of a healthcare plan, but that program was, I think, pretty limited and certainly not universal. But again, the point is that you have a democratic trajectory that's pushing meritocracy and investment in education as the solution instead of these broader social and economic rights. Barack Obama, who was like my guy in 2008, I can remember this speech, and I talk about it in the book, where he actually, in this speech, this was in Janesville, Wisconsin in 2008, says that, this has been a Washington, D.C. where, we've seen trade deals like NAFTA and workers have been left out of making sure they have the things that they need. And in this speech, he actually criticized Hillary Clinton's healthcare plan for not having a public option, right? Imagine the irony of that. Then becomes president, and the healthcare plan there's a lot of good things in that healthcare plan, right? But not having a public option, I think, was a deeply critical mistake. And again, Obama talks about the way to end poverty is giving people an education instead of the economic and social rights that people need. So when you think about something like healthcare, think about how that broad set of what's politically possible has narrowed so much in the past 40 or 50 years to the point where, what you hear is we're living in a meritocracy, people need to work hard, make sure they get the right education, instead of, no, everybody deserves these things, right? You deserve to have healthcare. You deserve to have a good job. We have to raise our expectations if we are going to get these things done. So I think what's really exciting to me about the last few years is you're starting to see, your very existence as an organization is proof of this. You're starting to see people put a broader call for economic, social democracy on the map in a way that's very exciting. I think Bernie's campaign clearly did that. This is from Progressive Democrats of America, and this is a sort of new version of FDR's Economic Bill of Rights for the 21st century. written by Alan Minsky, and Kay is Harvey Kay. He's a very good friend of mine who lives here in Green Bay, actually. And you can see it's very similar to the FDR Economic Bill of Rights, but it's updated for the 21st century: comprehensive quality healthcare, clean environment, and a healthy planet. And so you're seeing more politicians pick this up, by the way. I mean, I believe Marianne, I don't know how y'all feel about Marianne Williamson, but I believe Marianne Williamson has an economic bill of rights. This is something that Bernie actually had a version of in 2020. It's something that's kind of catching on, right? And so what I want y'all to think about is, when you think about pushing for universal healthcare, how do you embed it in this bigger call of political and economic possibilities? Because that's what we have to have is to have life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, a government that actively works to secure those things, all of those things. And I don't think we can do it kind of piecemeal. It has to be this sort of bigger political program. Workers are organizing, right? UAW is on strike now. Young people are organizing in Starbucks. You've got really good unions like the National Nurses Union that are pushing for Medicare for all. And so I think to that question of how we get there, it's going to take organizing. It's going to take really an inside-outside strategy of getting political figures to raise people's expectations, and all of us, whether it's in a union or an organization like this or something else, pushing those people and holding them accountable to the kind of economic and social rights that we all deserve. So I'll just kind of stop it there, and we can chat some more.
Well, first of all, John, thank you so much. And there's so much more meat even than we could take in one meal. Andy, I think you're going to organize the questions and look at what's in the chat. So why don't you start with something that you find in the chat, and then we can have people can use the hand raising.
All right. Yeah. Like John said, he's on our show weekly, so there's no question that's too tough. But let's just make sure we do a little bit of a back and forth. We just keep it somewhat respectful and not too chaotic. But that said, who's got some thoughts or discussion points?
That was a great presentation. Thank you so much. But what's going on today is two things: the Israel and Palestine conflagration, and what's at the conflagration in the Republican Party in Washington, D.C. Do you have any kind of statements or hopes that something positive can come out of this, particularly in Washington, D.C., and forget the foreign?
Here's the thing: the Republican Party is not a functioning party, really. It's a hodgepodge of individual interests, and a party that's in which the right wing has become so vicious and brutal that it's, at least in the House, it's eating itself, right? And I think the frustrating thing for me is there's so much opportunity for Democrats to build the kind of majority that could marginalize that kind of right-wing crap for so long, right? I mean, and to me, that's what's so amazing about what FDR and Democrats did in the 30s. And the problem, the frustrating thing is, you just don't see enough Democrats being able to link things to economic security, because that's what most people care about. Like I live in Green Bay, obviously, and Green Bay it's a working class town. We have conservatives here, but it's becoming a Democratic city because it's becoming way more diverse. But people who support our values, as I'll just say, as Democrats, I assume most of you are Democrats. Maybe some of you are further left than that. I don't know. But they support our values, but they don't always vote because they don't have people who run for office who actually give them a reason to, right? Who can speak to, these are the things that we're going to do to actually make your economic lives better, which is frankly what most people care about. And they're turned off by politics. They're turned off by hearing about things like they're not having a speaker in the House, right? So I think that if we could get more Democrats running for office who could be more coherent as a party about what our long-term plans are, the Republicans only win elections because Democrats have promised things and not delivered on them, right? It's like, every time a Democrat, that's what frustrated me so much about the Obama administration, is like the promises to hope and change. We're really going to change things, and the kind of things he talked about as a candidate in the primary, and to not have them come to fruition, I think really left us at a deficit, right? And you think about why there were somewhere between, it's hard to know exactly how many, but somewhere between 5 and 8 million people who voted for Obama in 2012 and then voted for Trump in 2016, right? How does that make any sense? Unless, I mean, certainly there are people who might do stuff for weird reasons. Maybe gender played a role in some of that. Okay. But certainly some portion of those people likely voted for Obama because they wanted things to change. And then when they didn't, they said, well, who's the next person who's going to promise something to change? So I think, again, the lesson with the utter debacle that's happening in Congress right now is that we should be beating these people and beating them easily. And it's because we don't have a clear economic and social message that we're not beating them.
Yeah, I'm here. And thank you very much, Cello. Yeah, so John, I really did appreciate your presentation and the historic overview on the many overtures that some Americans have tried to insert economic and social rights, and nothing come of it. So one of the things I was thinking about is how you fuse sort of that analogy, that analysis with looking at the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, created after the war, and where all of those rights, some of them that you highlighted, are all embodied in that document, and very concretely on the issue of the right to health care. The National Lawyers Guild has continuously gone to the United Nations complaining that the United States has not lived up to that document in terms of making sure that Americans have the right to health care. And the retort of the American government is, we're working on it. We can't really afford it. Now, let me just say that my understanding is that the United Nations, when they created this document, and the United Nations was created because so many countries were still under colonization or newly independent coming out of colonialization, made, sort of a some allowance for these countries because they were really poor to be able to, increase their standards and maybe bring some of these things to their populations. Well, obviously, the United Nations did not mean the developed world, but the United States has taken advantage of that kind of loophole. So I'm curious to know if you know about that, and how do you think we should be responding to that, besides outrage?
Yeah, that's great, and thanks for bringing that up. And you probably know that the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt was deeply involved in that, right? So there's a big connection with the FDR, economic Bill of Rights there for sure. You probably know more about that than I do, and I think it's abhorrent that American politicians would kind of use that loophole that's intended for developing world nations. I do think, that one of the problems, of course, with the UN is that, the US has never really been held accountable in that body, right? I mean, because of the kind of global power that we wield, and that's just the reality of it. So, I think, to me, it is important to continue to point out that inconsistency, and to point out that, when we go to the UN and try to hold other nations accountable for things, that like maybe we should be held accountable to international standards too. I think though, like I'm like I don't want this to sound too, I don't know what the word is, cynical maybe, because I don't mean it cynically, but I think the way things are going to change in the United States is for Americans to see something like universal healthcare as rooted in the American tradition. And, because nationalism is a very powerful force. And so I think, like, self-interest is too, right? I mean, I think we can get people to act, because I've never met one person. I've talked to a lot of people about this. I've never met one person who was like, I love my health insurance company. This is great. It is just great dealing with, a health insurance company that denies my claims and charges me money for things that I clearly shouldn't be charged for. So I think there's the clear, like, pragmatic case that everybody hates their health insurance. But I also think, like, framing this in the terms of, like, this is what it means to be an American, to advocate for these things. I think that's gonna probably be a better route for this than looking internationally, because the reality is, and again, I don't want to sound cynical. I'm with you. Like, I think we absolutely have an international responsibility as people. But I don't think most Americans think about things that way. Maybe I'm being overly cynical. And so that's why I'm kind of pushing for this, like, let's think about how this is rooted in, like, what it means to be an American. And I think, even laying claim to that international document in some way by saying things like, this comes out of, in many ways, is connected to the Economic Bill of Rights via Franklin and Eleanor, is one way to do that as well. But I really appreciate that context. I hadn't thought about some of the stuff you brought up.
I really appreciated your perspective, and as always, hearing labor's untold stories, it's really good. It's really important to remember that Sacco and Vanzetti and all of our unsung heroes. Everyone here knows about one payer state, and I've been working with one payer state pretty closely with Mike and Chuck, and we've spent quite a little bit of time thinking about how to promote and how to message, the universal healthcare message. And one of the things that, I don't know, because I have all of these great minds here, this is kind of just what I was thinking about. I'm not going to say they were, I was thinking about, is the same way that the Israeli people were able to reclaim the Israeli flag when they went out on the streets before this awful war, when they were demonstrating against Netanyahu's Supreme Court decisions. Is there any way that we, as universal healthcare advocates and as human rights advocates and as revolutionaries in that spirit of labor's untold story revolutionaries, is there any way that is it useful to think about how we can reclaim the flag?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I mean, I think it's not only useful, I think it's imperative, actually. I mean, you think about so many of the successful social movements in this country and how they've done that. And I teach a class right now called Historical Perspectives on American Democracy. And it's a class where I really try to carry that through line through American history. So, if you think about the abolitionist movement, there's a big debate in the abolitionist movement among Frederick Douglass and this kind of William Lloyd Garrison wing of the abolitionist movement, right? And Garrison was publicly burning. This is actually part of the reason why they had a falling out. Part of it was Garrison being jealous about Douglas's aptitude, but Garrison basically said the Constitution is a deal with the devil, and publicly burned it. And Douglas's argument, there's this famous speech that you probably have all heard reference on the 4th of July, but read the whole speech sometime if you haven't. What to the slave is the 4th of July, right? Where Douglas recounts all of the horrors of slavery and the massive contradictions in American history, but he concludes by saying that he was optimistic because the Declaration and the Constitution actually promises the end of slavery, right? He says, if you just hold the nation up to its own stated values, right, then that gives us the way out. And you think about Garrison burning the Constitution, there's no way out of that, right? You're not going to completely rip up the Constitution. What Douglas was doing was giving people a way to envision how to use the nation's fundamental premise to end slavery. And that's what happened during the Civil War. Douglas was right. The 1930s, again, the FDR speech, right, where he says, this is what we're doing with the New Deal is rooted in the context of the Declaration and the promise of America's founding. Eugene Debs, listen to some of his speeches in the 1890s, right? Same kind of thing, right? He basically says it's un-American what these companies are doing. Martin Luther King, I mean, the speeches he gives where he basically, you know, in the 60s talks about the necessity of, you know, he calls American democracy there's a metaphor that it completely sort of escapes me, but he basically says it's a check that hasn't been cashed or something like that. A promissory note. That's what he called it. Promissory note, right? So, you know, you think about all those movements and how successful they were. They weren't successful only because they made rhetorical arguments, right? I mean, they were successful because they organized. I mean, in the case of the Civil War, it was a literal war, right? It was workers organizing in the 30s. It was, you know, you want to think about a moment that makes you proud to be an American. Think about those activists having the courage to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965, right? So it was the organizing, but it was rooting that in the American idiom, and I think that that's not just advisable. I think it's essential. That's a great question.
You mentioned that establishing a universal healthcare program, or what we would prefer to call Medicare for all or single payer, should be part of a bigger program of an economic bill of rights. And I totally agree with that. You know, people have the right to housing, good education, good health care, transportation. The problem with addressing all those issues in this manner is that it's a basic attack on the paradigm that we live in this country, and that's capitalism.
Yep.
Capitalism is so rampant in this country, and you know, the seek for bigger and bigger profits and bigger margins of discrepancies in income. You know, this is something that I think is downplayed in Europe to a greater degree. And I'm just wondering how you would compare the paradigms that Europe has established, because most of them have single payer healthcare programs or something like that. Yep. And they don't have like guaranteed job programs like should happen, but their education's pretty much socialized as well, at least the funding of it. How do we get to that? How do we jump to that paradigm? Because we're not going to establish socialism in this country in my lifetime.
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing is those countries you're talking about in Europe, they're not socialist, right? I mean,
they are not.
Right. And so, you know, it is possible to do these things within the context of a capitalist paradigm, right? You know, you do have to, and that is a difference. I mean, I say this to my students all the time. You know, social democracy is not socialism. I mean, giving people economic rights, a system of Medicare for all. I mean, Medicare for all is not socialism. I mean, it's there. No. Doctors would still be practicing, you know, effectively in some version of private enterprise. It's not the National Health Service, right? So, you know, we would have to, you know, if we were really going to model ourselves on most European countries, it would still be in a capitalist sort of context. But I think, you know, what I'm suggesting is not that like you would literally have like one piece of, and I know you weren't saying I was saying this, but just so everybody's clear, you know, it wouldn't be like, hey, here's one piece of legislation with all of these like rights embedded in it, right? But it would be a program, say, that, you know, like let's go back to 2008 for a minute, all right? When Democrats had control of both houses of Congress, this massive majority, and a Democratic president for the first time since when was the last time before that happened? The 70s, maybe? Anyway, the point is that was a momentous opportunity. Imagine having that opportunity and going in and saying, all right, we've got 2 years to enact a set of massive social and economic legislation. And our lodestar is going to be an economic bill of rights. Okay. So it's like, all right, so what's the first thing? Like, what's our priority going to be? How do we ensure that everybody has housing, right? Well, we're going to do this, and then healthcare. And then if we're going to do that, how do we make sure that it's Medicare for all, and something that like actually, and I'm with you, Medicare for all is my preference too, by the way. Again, because putting things in the American idiom, Medicare is something that's deeply popular with people. We don't have to reinvent anything, right? I think that's what's so brilliant about that call for national healthcare. But within that sort of context, and then you have to, you have to mobilize people. You have to pass those laws, and you have to have a system in which there are ways to hold at bay the counter revolution, right? Which will come, right? The reactionaries, that the second they have a chance, they're going to try to whittle these things away. And, there are certain institutions that have to exist to really be able to do that. It wasn't an act like, Andy talked about this. It wasn't like there weren't right-wing business people in the 1950s who were trying to roll back New Deal legislation. But why didn't it happen? Because you had Democratic politicians who were willing to defend it, and you had a really, really strong labor movement, right? I mean, that's something that really, I think, has to be a big part of this, which is why there's this conversation in labor about health insurance. We have to move away from this paradigm of employer-sponsored healthcare. I think that's a huge part of this, because you have to have the actual like organizations that, again, to use a war metaphor, you got to have the troops that are going to go out and shut things down when somebody comes in and says they're going to, roll back, the healthcare that people have won legislatively. So like, I think, we have to think about this all in terms of a very big picture, and think about and I know it seems overwhelming at times, but things are changing dramatically in this country, right? And very rapidly. 90% of people under the age of 30 are supportive of labor unions. I mean, that's massive, right? There other polling you look at, I mean, socialism is no longer a bad word among young people. When I talk to my students and we talk about things like eliminating student loan debt and things like universal healthcare, they're like, yeah, we support that. They have to, because they know that they don't have any futures without those things. And so, I think it's a mobilizing and an organizing question. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Somebody wrote in the chat about, the kind of plans that the Republican Party has. This connection to Weimar is really, really important in the 1920s, because we are at a moment where I worry that because of all the political instability, that we could face right-wing authoritarianism. That is very, very close. And it's frustrating to continue to support Democrats that don't see the imperative of a bigger social and economic, raising of people's expectations. So it's like we have to like keep holding on until we can get to the moment where we can build this kind of bigger movement. But I think we can. I think it's happening. It's just it's an organizing problem,
Just to add on there, I think because at this point, like capitalism and socialism have become like these loaded words almost. And I feel like, not that rugged individualism is not as loaded, but I feel like framing it like that's kind of what has overtaken the minds of America. So we've managed to conflate this idea of rugged individualism. And if you just are, that's actually your opportunity to be just so successful that you'll amass so much profit. But the reality is, people are forgetting that always comes at a cost for someone else. And, part of the reason I brought up Weimar Republic is I'm trying to do shorthand for the word fascism, but a lot of ink has been spilled even before the 2016 election, that it's just a natural, not just Weimar Republic, but even the neo-Nazis in Germany in the 90s and other parts of the world where fascism it's just a natural phenomenon for that energy to go. Even in the 1920s, the Klan, in the Lochner era, it's a natural thing for people's energy to flow in this direction, to go into the culture war aspect, which is what somebody, I don't know if you want me to say your name, but someone mentioned about, the culture war. It makes, for instance, if you're transgender in America, like people don't feel safe because it's just that's part of the new politics, which my contention is always, if you reverse engineer the Weimar Republic or any of these bad scenarios, the way to heal is for these economic rights. If you take care of society as a whole, it doesn't matter if you're a left or left, right, Republican or Democrat. You will take away some natural tension in society, so people don't have to be so angry. Because the anger, I think, is a natural human reaction to not having these economic rights.
Yeah, well, and you think about some of these right-wing politicians that are actively stoking these things. Florida, the don't say gay bill. I mean, we just had the Republicans try to pass a bunch of just disgusting anti-trans bills here a couple weeks ago in Wisconsin. They do it because they don't have anything that they can offer to working people, right? Nothing. I mean, other than reducing taxes for the wealthy and reducing workers' rights, and to some extent they know that, right? So the only thing that they can do is really divide us along these lines of identity, in the same way that Hitler did that. I mean, I try not to like overstate the the comparisons to Hitler, because that's not literally where we are in this country, but that politics. I mean, you can carry this through, and by the way, this is the Republican Party. This isn't just Trump, right? I mean, you mentioned this, and that's an important point. I mean, Reagan pioneered this back in the 70s when he talked about welfare queens and all these things, and um Pat Buchanan in the 80s and 90s, and scapegoating gay people, right? And George W. Bush probably won the presidential election in 2004 in Ohio by opposing gay marriage. So like this is a well-established playbook, and this idea that like, Republicans have just, I know you weren't saying this, but like you sometimes hear this, like, oh, these Republicans are now suddenly going after identity. It's like, no, they've always done this because they're the party of the rich, right? They actually don't have anything for working people. And so when that's the case, you try to drive a wedge between people and try to divide us, and that's what we can't let happen. That's why we got to talk about these social and economic issues, but we also have to connect them to issues like trans rights and being able to talk about racial inequality in this country, because those things are connected, right? What we need in this country, what we have to be able to talk about on the left, is building the kind of multiracial democracy that we all deserve, right? Where the economic and social needs of everybody in this country are met, whether they're white, Black, Latino, LGBTQ, whatever, right? And when we do that, like that's when the corporate powers that have been running things, that's when we actually defeat them and build the kind of world that we deserve.
I have a comment, and I'm just about halfway through Heather Cox Richardson's new book, which I would highly recommend. I heard her speak Friday night, and she's got a great synopsis. And I mentioned to many, Richard Wolff had a great history of the U.S. labor movement on alternative radio last Saturday morning. But, the problem is the Democratic Party is almost functionally worthless itself in terms of the common people. I mean, with waning union support, they turn to the financial industry for the money, and it's all about the money. Then you add Citizens United, and it's a hellbound train, I think, that is maybe dang near impossible to stop. I mean, it's all about the money, and there's only a handful, I think, even of honest Democrats who will do anything outside of that paradigm. And then you've got the modern equivalent of Joseph Goebbels in Fox News that further polarizes and demonizes anything that even smells close to socialism, which, of course, they all believe. These new movement conservatives, that everything FDR was horrible socialism, and their goal is to take it all apart. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we've tried. I mean, they threw Bernie under the bus twice. I mean, he was the populist choice for non-Republicans in this country, and the Democrats stuck their nose up and threw him under the bus and missed their opportunity. I don't know how we're going to get this train, with all of its unrestrained capitalistic momentum, slowed down, let alone turned.
Yeah. So look, all the stuff you're saying is true. And read my book, man. I mean, because like, that's basically what I talk about, is how the Democratic Party went in that direction. And I think it was just like egregious mistake after egregious mistake. And, And part of the reason it's not even just about waning union support. A lot of working class people either didn't vote or defected when Democrats either accommodated capital in the first place, or they accommodated a growing like professional class in this country. See, that's part of the thing that we don't talk about too, is like professional class liberals who push the party away from not just blue collar interests, but like there's this book that I talk about in the book by one of the kind of historians of the DLC, the Democratic Leadership Council. And what he was an insider, and what he basically said was the Democrats reinvented themselves in the 70s and 80s because special interests, labor, civil rights, he said, had kind of taken over the party, right? And what he was saying is basically that like they needed to have the kind of reasonable professional class, middle class people who were, you know, to be like the adults in the room and stop them from pushing these special interests. Well, these special interests were actually the like the foundation of the party, right? Civil rights, labor unions, right? And so it was party leaders that kind of went in that direction, in part because of some reforms that were made by McGovern in '72. So that's part of it, right? Is like moving in that direction. But these are the things that I would tell you to remember. And you know, I believe in maybe I'm misguided here, but you know, the Italian Marxist Antonio Gramsci talked about the idea of pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will, right? And we don't have any other choice but to have optimism of the will right now, because we have a very narrow path to defeat fascism. And the things that keep me going are, you know, you think about that 2016 election when like literally nobody thought it was worth running against Hillary Clinton. And the fact that, you know, Bernie and all the people that were behind Bernie, and, you know, the fact that he won in my state every single county in the Democratic Party primary except for one. I mean, there's a thirst for this. Same thing in 2020. I think the Bernie campaign made some strategic mistakes, by the way. Yeah, there was a establishment coup in 2020 against him. Absolutely, there was. But the fact that he was even on the map and that you had all these people behind him, especially young people, now some of whom are, you know, in places like West Virginia, as Eric Blanc's work show, leading teacher strikes, you know, and becoming part of the Chicago Teachers Union and pushing for social movement unionism in Chicago. It's frustrating to not see more prominent national Democrats being able to talk about the case for social democracy. But you know, like you see Biden on the picket line with the UAW workers. That didn't happen because Biden like wants to be on the picket line. It happens because, you know, he's smart enough, or somebody around him is smart enough to understand that these striking workers across this country are part of something that's changing. And if you want that union endorsement, if you want to show that you're with workers, you better get your ass out there and be there, even if, you know, you didn't do enough to support the Protect the Work to Organize Act that should have been passed. All the things that you're saying are true. I think we do have to remind ourselves that there is a growing amount of momentum, especially among young people, to have a different world. And what we got to do, for those of us who have been around this for a little bit longer, is, you know, we got to be the stewards to help kind of channel things and be activists ourselves. But, you know, what else can we do?
How do you enact change? And I think I would add that I've actually made a lot of breakthrough with conservative and Republican friends when I talk just about the issue of healthcare. I feel like the oligarchy in the United States exists on this. It treats politics like team sports of Democrat and Republican. And if I just don't participate in that, which could include, you know, calling out the Democrats, so there's plenty of criticism you can make. But I think that if we are going to fix, at the end of the day, like you know, I have family that are conservatives and Republicans. I want them to have healthcare the same way I want Democrats and whoever. I know that as a human species, it's the only path forward. And I think that if we're looking to the solution of how do we talk about this, if you're in that position, you need to make sure you're always your rhetoric and your language is staying on the issue. What is the truth of the problem? For anybody who's out there doing, you know, trying to enact change. Because I think that it's just, unfortunately, a lot of the culture war and the I don't know, it's just become too much of a team sport. And whenever I'm out there fighting for healthcare, I'm always trying to bring it back to just the issue. That's my 2 cents. But
Yeah,
good advice.
I think we shouldn't be afraid to criticize Democrats I also do think, though, that, man, the problem is the structure in this country is one in which really the only alternative is changing the Democratic Party. I mean, a third party just can't win. I mean, not in a way that I mean, especially now, you can't throw elections to fascists, and we're in such a conundrum. That's what makes it hard.
Well, since you're a history scholar, John, this is where you could shed some light. The Republican Party was a third party. So what's the difference there? Why was the Republican Party able to do it?
Well, for two reasons, I think. One is the Whig Party had effectively collapsed, so there really was only kind of like one party. It had become a regional party at that point. It couldn't win national elections. But the second reason is that, the Republicans picked up on an issue that was of such importance that within that context, and the issue was, it actually wasn't abolitionism, it was stopping the spread of slavery, to maintain economic opportunities for white farming families. I mean, like, that's the reality of it. You just look at the rhetoric. I mean, some of them, like Lincoln, were abolitionists, but many of them weren't. They were largely devoted to stopping the spread of slavery, at least at first. Then it became part of the Republican platform during the war, when the war became about slavery. But it was really that sort of vacuum of not having another functional party, and having an issue that no one else was speaking to at all. And so I think we have one of those two things now, right? Like, I think a third party, like a Labor Party, let's say, could speak to the issue of economic inequality. But I think the problem is that structurally, both of the two major parties are so entrenched, and the conversation about money, right? We were just talking about, that was Hugh's point. These parties have so many locked in financial and structural resources that it's like, you could imagine a third party winning elections, like eventually, kind of supplanting one of the two parties, but it would take such a long time that by that point, Republicans would just win so many elections that it would, our next election or two could be our last, depending on how much Republican control there is, and I don't say that lightly. I mean, that's just the reality of it. So, that's what makes it tough, is like, we don't have a path where we could overcome the structural advantages that the two-party system has to build a third one. We just can't.
I think Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the start of a viable third party.
Please,
Joe?
God. No.
Well, he's supposed to take a lot of votes away from Trump. It's so weird how whoever would win, it's about the other side underperforming. That's the sad. But I will say, John, it's funny because I have a relative who's, I think, is in his 70s, and he said every election now feels existential. He's a Wisconsin citizen, and he just said it's crazy now, at his age. Every election just feels like this. But again, I guess that's kind of like why we're all here tonight. It's kind of like, is this almost near impossible to achieve this? Maybe, but the alternative is just to let society crumble into an abyss. And so we have no choice but to move forward and have courage. Really.
I don't think it is. I don't think it is near impossible. And you have to remember that social movements don't change in a linear fashion, right? It's not like, you pick up one person at a time until you reach some kind of threshold. Things change very rapidly, and Jesus, man, you think about the people in this country that have put shit on the line to change things. Frederick Douglass, I mean, who liberated himself and then became an abolitionist under, at any moment, could have been kidnapped, murdered, speaking up against slavery, and then putting his own sons at risk during the Civil War, and basically saying to Black people in this country, Black men in particular, you need to fight to end this institution of slavery, because that's the only way we're going to do it. You think about those workers who went on strike in the 1930s, with company goons. Walter Reuther, the president of the United Auto Workers, got the shit beat out of him by Ford goons when they were trying to organize. And this, he's the president of the union. And again, you think about the courage that it took for civil rights protesters to go against the Edmund Pettus Bridge, knowing there were a bunch of white supremacist cops on the other side with billy clubs. Man, that's our tradition. And that's our tradition as Americans. That's what it really means to be an American, right? And how do we do anything else? And in those situations, it's hard to imagine things looking bleaker than walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, but things changed and we can change them too. And things happen oftentimes more rapidly than you think.
Yeah, someone wrote in the chat here also about how we tie in the concept of employer-sponsored healthcare. And I know that other people like Scott Zane from Food Not Bombs. I don't know, Scott, do you want to ask the question or John? But I mean, I imagine a shorthand version of this question of the status is basically the status quo. Like it's someone wrote, so John wrote, a different John, he wrote, can you give a little perspective on people pointing out that employer-sponsored healthcare solves the problem if people would just go to work?
You know, when you're dependent on your employer for healthcare, you're dependent on your employer. Yeah, I mean, the beauty of the labor movement is this concept of and really industrial democracy, that like you don't give up all your rights the second that you walk onto the job. And so taking healthcare out of that equation gives you more freedom toward your employer. It's something everybody should have. It allows you to quit your job if you want to. It gives you more freedom all the way around. And as a union, and this is an argument my friend Lane Wyndham makes, she's writing a book about this. She basically says bargaining for that, if you are lucky enough to be in a union that has a collectively bargained contract, if you have universal health care, Medicare for all, whatever version you want to call it, that takes that off of the plate. That's not something that unions then have to negotiate for. It takes away another piece of leverage that employers have. It takes away the leverage they have to break strikes, right? What's one of the first things that employers do when workers go on strike? They take away their health care because they know how damn expensive it is, right? And all those UAW workers right now who are on strike, they're paying COBRA level premiums. The union's paying for that, right? So you take that off the plate, off the things that unions have to negotiate, and all of a sudden unions, workers of all stripes have a lot more freedom.
Well, John, someone actually just privately messaged me that tonight actually gives them, they're going to go to bed here, but they said tonight has given them some hope. And they are actually a member of one of the marginalized groups. And honestly, with what David asked you originally, I thought about that anyway, because obviously what's going on in the news is very unsettling and depressing. And my goal tonight, I was going to say it, I kind of cut myself short, but I wanted to have tonight give people hope. So we did that. We achieved it. We gave at least one person hope, hopefully some other people. And someone actually also asked in the chat if they can look at your PowerPoint, if they can have access to this PowerPoint.
Sure. Yeah. Share. You could share it with whoever you want to share it with.
Cool. Yeah. Eric's did. If you want to chime in at any questions, Eric, he's down in the SoCal. We had a lot of people. We had people from across the United States tonight. We had people from Lower Texas, Colorado, Los Angeles, Portland, Oregon.
I do appreciate, John, you coming on here tonight and talking. I've really enjoyed listening to you speak tonight. And when you were on Majority Report, you just really have a great way of, getting your message across. And I just wonder, John, going forward, do you think it's maybe a good idea for people who believe as you do and believe as I do and Andy does? I feel like people who have a platform like those on YouTube, politicians who can get on the news should work together to create a group type messaging to get our platform out there. So it seems like it gets lost in the sauce with regular news programming. And then it's just like a bunch of talking heads screaming over each other. Whereas if you say yourself, Heather Cox Richardson, Anand Giridharadas, as writers, journalists, and authors, got together with the squad or people from the squad on a national level, local level, and actually went on YouTube together, you would get, I would imagine, huge audience, absolutely huge audience that you could share this message with more people. So anyway, that's my question, John.
So Eric, you're saying, would I like to be in a room with Heather Cox Richardson, Anand Giridharadas, and the squad? The answer to that is hell yes. If you can get me into that room, I am there, man.
I don't know if I have the power to get you into that room, but somebody obviously does. And it's just an idea that I had.
Yeah.
To get everybody together.
I think you all have just come up with a good, upbeat, far out, crazy idea that's suitable for ending this program, as it is now 8:59 p.m. Pacific time, and I think 10:59 p.m. John time. So we ought to respect his need for sleep and let him go.
I appreciate it. As I told Andy, I'm usually up late, so no, this was fun. Really appreciate the conversation. Y'all are a great group. Keep in touch. Share anything you want to share, and yeah, thanks so much for the conversation.
Put it in the chat if you guys want the. You can email me or contact me if anybody wants the PowerPoint from tonight, and definitely check out John's book.
Yeah, do that.
So
Oh, yeah.
we've got this recorded, and we'll send it out, put it on our YouTube channel in 2 or 3 days at the most. And also, I was going to say earlier that Helen Cox Richardson was at Town Hall here a few days ago, and Hugh Foy was there and sent the link, and I watched the whole hour of it, and it's really worth watching. So this goes right along with stuff that you've been saying. So I'll put a link to that when I put the monthly report out.
Okay.
Cool. I'll put a link to the book in here too. You can also buy it on Amazon if that's something you're into, but this is right from the publisher website.
Okay, great. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Let's sign off now, and tomorrow is another day.
All right, thanks everybody.
Will
John.
come up. Okay.
Good night.
Let's stay on here to put
All power to the people.